And welcome to Dark Academia Queen. Today we're going to be talking about the life of one of my favorite poets. This will be a two-part episode, and everything. So, if you're new here, hit that like button or bell for notifications. Also, please subscribe. Help a girl out. Also, I hope everyone is having a happy 4th. Remember, stay safe. If you drink, don't drive. Please don't. The road's dangerous. It's dangerous enough. Don't drink and drive. We don't need. We don't need you hurting yourself or the life of someone else. Someone else. Now, let's talk about Walt Whitman, shall we? We know he was born Walter Whitman Jr. He was a poet, essayist, and journalist. He also is considered to be one of the most influential poets in American literature. He incorporated both transcendentalism and the realism into his writings and is often called the father of preverse, and his work is controversial in his time and was described as somewhat as crude and overt sensual. Now, he was born in Huntington on Long Island and lived in Brooklyn as a child, and through much of his career, when he was 11, he left formal school training and got to work. He worked as a journalist, and he was financed with money to become a well-known. The work was an attempt to reach out to the common person of American epic. Whitman continued expanding and revising Leaves of Grass until his death in 1892. Now, during the Civil War, he went to Washington, D.C., where he worked in hospitals caring for the wounded, and his poetry often focused on both loss and healing. On the assassination of Lincoln, Whitman greatly admired um, he authored two poems, "O Captain, My Captain," and "When Lilacs and Dooryards Bloom," and he also gave a series of lectures on Lincoln. Sorry guys, I have an ulcer in my mouth and it hurts like crazy right now. But anyway, after suffering a stroke at the end of his life, Whitman moved to Camden, New Jersey. Why Camden, New Jersey? Isn't New Jersey like the armpit of America? So I've been told. Never been there, but I've been told that it's like the armpit of America. But anyway, he moved there where his health further declined and he died at 72. His funeral was a public event and his influence on poetry remains strong. So, well, let's talk about his life and work now. We're going to start with his early life. Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819 in West Hills, New York. He was the second of 9 children to have Quaker parents, Walter and Louisa Van Vesler Whitman, of English and Dutch descent, and he was immediately nicknamed Walt to distinguish him from his father. At the age of 4, Whitman moved from his family in Huntington to Brooklyn, living in a series of home and part of a bad investment. Now, Whitman looked back on his childhood and generally restless and unhappy given his family's difficult economic struggles. One happy moment was that when he received a letter that was lifted from the air, kissed on the cheek by the Marquise de Lafayette during a celebration of the Brooklyn Apprentices Library Cornerstone by Lafayette in Brooklyn on July 4th, 1825. Now, Whitman would work as a librarian at the institution, and at the age of 11, he would leave his former schooling and sought employment to assist his family, while they were struggling economically. And he was the office boy for 2 lawyers and later apprentice and printer's devil for a weekly Long Island newspaper in the Patriot, um, which was edited by Samuel E. Clemens. Now, there, Whitman learned about printing, press, and typesetting. He may have also written some sentimental bits or filler material and occasional he issues. Now, Clements around controversy when he and 2 friends attempted to dig up the corpse of a Quaker minister, Elias Hicks, to create a plaster mold head. Clements left the pastor shortly after, and possibly as a result of the controversy. So, what about his early career? Well, I'm going to focus on the age now so here's the thing. The following summer, Whitman worked for another printer, Erastus Worthington, in Brooklyn. His family moved back to West Hills, New York, on Long Island in the spring, but Whitman remained there. As a took a job of Alden Spooner, editor of the leading Whig weekly newspaper of the Long Island Star. And while at the Star, he became a regular patron of the local library, joined the town debating team, and he was attending theater performances and anonymously published some of his earliest poetry in the New York Mirror. And at the age of 16, in May of 1835, he would leave the Star in Brooklyn. Um, he moved to New York City as a conspirator there in later years, and he could not remember where. He attempted to find further work, but had difficulty in part due to a severe fire in printing in the publishing district, and part of a general collapse in the economy leading up to the Panic of 1837. In May 1836, he joined his family, now living in Hempstead, Long Island. Whitman, sorry, taught intermittently at various schools until the spring of 1838. Though he was not satisfied as a teacher, and after his teaching attempts, he returned to Huntington, New York, to find his own newspaper, the Long Islander, and he served as a publisher, editor, and pressman and distributor, and even provided home delivery. After 10 months, he sold the publication to E. O. Crowell, whose first issue appeared July 12, 1839. There were no surviving copies of the Long Islander that was published under Whitman, but by the summer of 1839 he found a job as a typesetter in Jamaica, Queens, with the Long Island Democrat editor James J. Britton, and shortly left thereafter. So, in another attempt at teaching from winter in 1840 to spring 1841, one story tells of Whitman being chased away from a teaching job in South Hole, New York in 1840, and after a local preacher called a sodomite, Whitman was allegedly tarred and feathered. Biographer Justin Kaplan notes that the story is likely untrue because Whitman regularly vacationed in the town thereafter. A biographer by the name of Jerome Loving would call the incident a myth as well. So, Whitman would move to New York City in May, initially working as a low-level job at New World, working under Park Benjamin Sr. and Rufus Wilmot Griswold, and he continued to work for a short period for various newspapers. In 1842, he was editor of the Aurora, and from 1846 to 1848, he was editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. So, it was while working at a later institution that many publications were in the area of public criticism, and during this time he became a devoted lover of Italian opera. Though reviewing the performances work by Bellamy, Donizetti, and Verdi, the new interest had an impact on his writings and preverse. He later said, "But for the opera, I could never have written Lisa Green." So, throughout the 1840s, he contributed freelance fiction and poetry to various periodicals, and this would include the Brother Jonathan's magazines that was edited by John Neal. He also lost his position at the Brooklyn Eagle in 1848. Um, After he was siding with like a free soil barn burner wing of the Democrat Party against the newspaper's owner, Isaac Van Handen, who belonged to a conservative or hunker wing of the party, and Whitman was a delegate to the 1848 convention of the Free Soil Party, which was concerned about the threat of slavery and was opposed of the free white labor in the northern businessman and the newly colonized western territories. Now, an abolitionist by the name of William Lord Garrison derided the party's philosophy as a white manism. So, in 1852, he serialized a novel entitled The Life and Adventure of Jack Ingle in the sixth installment of the New Yorker, the Sunday's Dispatch. In 1858, he published a 47,000-word series called Manly Health and Training under the pen name Most Vessler. Apparently, he drew the name Vessler from his mom's family name. And this self-help guide recommends beard, nude sunbathing, comfortable shoes, bathing in cold water, eating meat almost exclusively, plenty of fresh air, and getting early in the morning. Now, present day writers have called manly health and training quirky, so over the top of a pseudo scientific track and wacky. Y'all want to know this leaves the grass, right? Well, he claimed that the after years of completing the usual rewards, he determined to become a poet. His first experimented with a variety of popular literary genres that appealed to the cultural taste, and as of 1850, he began writing what would become Leaves of Grass, a collection of poetry that would be continued editing and revising until his death. He intended to write a distinctly poetry epic and use a free verse with a cadence based on the Bible. Mm, excuse me. But at the end of June 1855, Whitman surprised his brother with the already first edition of Blades of Grass, and George didn't think it was worth reading. So, Whitman paid the publication of the first edition of the Blades of Grass himself, and it printed a local print shop during their break and commercial jobs, and a total of 795 copies were printed. No author is named. Instead, facing the title page was engraved a portrait done by Samuel Hollier. But 500 lines of the body of the text, he called himself Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a Cosmo, disorderly, freshly, and sensual, no sentimentalist, no slander above men and women, or apart from him, and no more modest than immodest. So, the inaugural volume of poetry preceded by the prose preference in 18 for the 827 lines. The succeeding untitled 12 poems total about 2,315 lines, give or take. Anyway, the first edition of Leaves of Grass was widely distributed and stirred up a significant interest. On July 11, 1855, a few days just after it was published, his father died at the age of 65. In the months following to the first edition of Leaves of Grass, there was many critical responses of potentially offensive sexual themes. The second edition was already published, printed and bound, and the publisher almost did not release it. In the end, the edition went to retail with 20 additional poems. So, but several well-known authors admired the work and would visit him, and these would include Almus Branson Alcock and Henry David Thoreau. So, let's talk about his Civil War years now. In American Civil, we all know what happened in the Civil War, right? I don't have to give like a full history on that one. But as the Civil War was beginning, Walt, Whitman, I need to go to bed, y'all. Whitman published his poem "Beat, Beat, 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 Beat Drums" as the patriotic rally for the Union, and Whitman's brother had joined the Union Army in the 51st New York Infantry Regiment and began sending Whitman several vividly detailed letters at the battlefront. It was on December 16, 1862, that a listing of fallen or wounded soldiers in the New York Tribune included First Lieutenant G.W. Whitmore, in which Whitman worried about the reference to his brother George. He would make his way to the South immediately to find him, and through his wallet it was stolen along the way. In Washington, D.C., his Whitman's friend Charlie Eldridge helped him obtain a part-time job as in the Army's paymaster office, leaving time for Whitman to volunteer as a nurse in the Army hospitals to experience the Great Army of the Sick, which was published in New York newspaper in 1863. and 12 years in a book called Memoranda During the War. So, he would then contact Emerson, remember him? Yeah, and this time to ask for help obtaining government post. So, an although friend, John Throwbridge passed a letter of recommendation from Emerson to Salmon P. Chase, hoping to grant Whitman a position in the department. It was not, he did not hire the author because of his book Leaves of Grass. So the Whitman family had a difficult end to 1864, and on September 30th, 1864, his brother George was captured by the Confederate forces in Virginia, and another brother, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I really just hate that name. Hate Andrew Jackson. I know it's not the same Andrew Jackson, but anyway, would die of TB and compounded by alcoholism on December 3rd. And that month, Whitman would committed his brother Jesse to the King County Lunatic Asylum, and Whitman's spirits were raised. And however, when he finally got a better paying government job, post as a low grade clerk at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Um, Thanks to his friend William Douglas O'Connor. So, Whitman would begin his new appointment on January 24th, 1865, with a yearly salary of $1,200. And a month later, on February 24th, 1865, George was released from capture and granted a furlough because of his poor health. And on May 1st, Whitman received a promotion to a slightly higher clerkship and published drum taps. On June 30th, 1865, Whitman was fired from his job. His dismissal came from the new Secretary of the Interior. And though Harlan dismissed several clerks, who was seldom at their respective desks, he may have fired Whitman on moral grounds after finding an 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. And O'Connor protested J. Hubley's Ashton's, and Whitman transferred to the Attorney General's office on July 1st. So, seems like this book was causing him more harm than good, but it was one of his most famous works, though, that's the thing. But O'Connor, though, was still very upset and vindicated that Whitman by publishing a biased, exaggerated biographical study called The Good Grey Poet in January 1866. In the 50-cent pamphlet, defended Whitman as a wholesome patriot and established the poet's nickname and increased his popularity. Part of Whitman's role in the Attorney General's office was interviewing former Confederate soldiers for president's pardons. In August 1866, he took the month off to prepare a new edition of Leaves of Grass, which would not be published until 1867, after he had difficulty finding a publisher. He hoped it would be his last edition. In February 1868, Poems of Walt Whitman was published in England, thanks to an influence of William Michael Rossetti. With minor changes that Whitman reluctantly approved, the edition became popular in England, especially with endorsements of the highly respected writer Anne Gilchrist. He would then publish another edition in 1871. In that same year, it was mistakenly reported that the author died of a railroad accident. And after his international fame increased, as he remained at the Attorney General's office until January 1872, where he spent much of 1872 caring for his mom, who was nearly 80 and struggling with arthritis. And he was also traveled and was invited to Dartmouth College to give a commencement address June 26, 1872. So, let's talk. What about the health decline and death? Well, he will spend most of his time at his home in Camden, New Jersey, which is open to the public as the Walt Whitman House. He suffered a paralytic stroke in early 1873, and he was induced to move to Washington to the home of his brother, George Washington Whitman. His family took a lot of names for a lot of American presidents, I noticed. But anyway, his mom had fallen ill and was there and died the same year in May. Both events were difficult for Whitman and left him depressed, and he remained at his brother's home until buying his home in 1884. However, before purchasing his home, he spent the greatest period of his residence in Camden at his brother's home on Stephen Street. So while he was there in residence, he was still very productive, publishing 3 versions of Lisa Grass. Among the works, he was also last physically active in the house, receiving both Oscar Wilde and Thomas Eakins. And his other brother Edward, an quote invalid unquote since birth, lived in the house. So what happened? Well, when his brother and his sister-in-law were forced to move to for business reasons, he bought his own house. And the first taken care of by tenants, he was completely bedridden for a month on Mickle Street. And during this time, he began socializing with Mary Oak Davis, who was the widow of a sea captain. She was a neighbor boarding with a family in Bridge Avenue, just a few blocks on Mickey Street. She moved in with Whitman February 24th, 1885, to serve as a housekeeper in exchange for free rent. So, she brought with her a cat, a dog, 2 turtle doves, okay, I'm getting sidetracked. A canary, and other assorted animals. And during this time, he produced further editions of Lisa Grass. So it was while in South Jersey that he spent a good portion of his time in the quiet pastoral community of Laurel Springs between 1876 and 1884, and he converting one of the Stafford home buildings into his summer home. He then restored the home has been preserved in the museum by a local historical society as well. And as the end of 1891 approached, he prepared a final edition of Leasing Grass. So, Walt Whitman died on March 26, 1892, in Camden at the age of 72. An autopsy revealed that his lungs had diminished 1/8 of their normal breathing capacity and result of bronchial pneumonia, and it was the egg-sized abscess in his chest. So what was his cause of death officially listed as? Pleurisy on the left side, consumption on the right lung, general military TB, and paramyxis nucleus. And 4 days after his death, he was buried at a tomb in Camden. Alright, that is it for the first episode. Join me next time as we talk about his writing, his relationships, and all of that.